Joining me in the city of Edmonton, Alberta at Breakforth, Canada is Dr. Ron Hunter. He is the CEO of Randall House, which is a Christian publisher dedicated to finding new ways to help both the church and the home disciple all generations. Ron is also the co-founder and director of the D6 Conference. Ron, welcome to 100 Huntley Street.
Thank you, Robert. It's good to be here. And thank you for noting that we care about all generations.
All generations
Yes.
is
Yeah,
key.
it is.
Now, you know, Ron, for all generations, and I'm kind of a lifer in the church, and so I've heard growing up in the church, the generational breakdown, etc., and how youth are important, right. And then we emphasize the youth, and then we leave out the seniors, grandmas and grandpas, and all that. But what's always remained true is this command that Jesus gave us, and that is to disciple all people. And unfortunately today, we're losing a generation of young people. So let's just focus on the young people. Why are we losing this generation?
Right. I think there's a couple of reasons for this, Robert. When we look at the church today, there is a group of young people that have been raised in church, and one of two things are going to occur to them. The ones who stay all the way through, they have been in a youth ministry that is so cool and so wonderful and so isolated from their other church. It's called the one-eared Mickey Mouse, if you would. Stuart Cummings Bond used that term in the late 80s. You got church here and you got a youth ministry over here, kind of that one ear of Mickey Mouse. And when the youth minister makes that department so cool and so great, they do not want to return back to the uncool adult church. And so oftentimes they'll leave an average-sized church to a mid-sized church to go be part of a mega church. And so we lose them there. But as you stated, we're also losing people away from church. And part of it is the hypocrisy of the parents. We have compartmentalized, going back to that Mickey Mouse, whenever we say that youth ministry can be the one ear on Mickey Mouse, sometimes church becomes the one ear on the head of life. And we compartmentalize, we have church over here and we have that life getting in the way.
Right.
And so they see two sides of their parents. And so as a result, what we need to do is recognize that we've got to have consistency. Discipling means not an event. Discipleship is not an event. It is a way of life.
Right.
And that's what we're missing. We just emphasize the excellence at church.
Now, when we talk about discipleship, and you're right in what you're saying, and you know, confession is good for the soul. And so growing up in a Christian church, discipleship wasn't an exciting term.
No, it was not.
And it wasn't even an exciting process.
Right.
But we're supposed to disciple. Yet when you look at it, it's what Jesus, again, commanded us to do. So through losing generations of young people, even going back,
Right.
this idea of the D6, which is a process. So tell us what D6 is and how D6 works.
Yeah, absolutely. D6 is short for Deuteronomy 6. It's that classic passage in the Old Testament where God is commanding the nation of Israel to, first of all, in summary, love Him, love His Word, and by an overflow of the events of life, teach your kids to do the same thing. The number one influencers of a child's values, specifically their worldview, is mom, then dad, then grandma and grandpa, and in spiritual terms, the lead pastor. Now, if that's the case, why aren't we putting more emphasis teaching our parents and grandparents how to emphasize teachable moments? Not every conversation needs to be a sermon, but we need to look for just ways to connect the dots. To say, hey, what about our lesson from Sunday? How does that apply to this decision you're about to make? And we just use those to navigate that. You know, the confession for me, you know, Deuteronomy 6 was such a way of life for the children of Israel from Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply. God included the genealogies. I don't like reading them, but they're there for a reason. God said the trajectory of families are important. Joshua's, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. His family served the Lord, but the generations around him rose up and knew about the Lord. And in Judges chapter 2, in just 3 generations, there rose up a generation who knew not God. I think in many ways the church today is that generation rising up knowing not God. And if we fast forward to the Old Testament, Nehemiah chapter 8, we find that they just finished building the wall in 52 days. Ezra stands and presents the law. The next day, the men are studying the word, and they go back to Ezra and the priests, and they say, we found this verse on this idea of the Feast of Tents. What is it? And they explain it about God's provision and all that it did for the Hebrew children. Said, we're supposed to be celebrating this every year. And they said, we haven't done that. And the men immediately gathered their families together, and the moms and the dads taught their own children under these lean-tos in their houses or on top of their rooftops and in their courtyards. They didn't ask the priests to come and do it. They did it themselves. And what happened in the church today is we walk over to the children's ministers, to the youth pastors, and to the lead pastors and say, you do it. And at the end of Nehemiah chapter 8 said, this has not happened since the days of Joshua, the son of Nun. So we have from the oldest time to the newest time that gap. And I believe there's a gap in the church today. We once had moms and dads connected, and they're not connected now.
Now, let me ask, personally, as a child growing up, did you have that idea of the D6 in your family? And what about today raising children?
Yeah, I wished I did. Let me say growing up, I had a great mother and father. I mean, I really have a great relationship with them. We were involved in church, but my parents did divorce when I was 15. And so there was some compartmentalization going on in my own world. And now even as a mom or as a dad, my wife is a mom, I would say that I've learned more in the last few years, the last decade and a half, that I wished I knew 20 years ago. My kids are out of college now. They're both serving Christ. But I could have done things better. And I really wished I had known back then what I know now.
Mm-hmm. So there's people that are watching. I mean, the idea that they can relate and say, well, I never was, I never did, but you can always begin.
Well, we got to break a cycle. I think there are a lot of kids who have gone through and done well, but as you stated, we're losing a generation. And we're losing a generation because we're not being intentional enough. Mm-hmm. And Deuteronomy 6 is about intentionality.
Mm-hmm. Now, the title of the book, Ron, D6, is it?
Yeah, it's DNA of D6, building blocks of generational discipleship.
Now, pastors and church leaders who have embraced the idea, the process.
Right.
What's been their comment? Is it working? Is it growing disciples like biblically we should be?
Let me quickly state to you, Deuteronomy 6 is not a quick fix. We did not get where we are in 1 or 2 years. It's taken generations. It's going to take a generation to get out of this habit because we're establishing new ideas, new worldviews, and new patterns. The churches who are getting into the D6 philosophy, they're seeing marriages become tighter. They're seeing relationship connects that are at a deeper level than surface level. And they're seeing a chance for that faith to go beyond the nucleus of a family into peer-to-peer relationships, unlike what we've seen before. It is making a big change. And I could say, while D6 has had a contribution to it, a significant one, God was already at work before we came along, because that's always been his original plan. It goes back to the very beginning of Scripture.
And it's a process.
It is a process.
Yeah.
A long one.
Okay.
A long one.
You know what, Ron? It's I'm really encouraged by what you're saying, and I growing up and hearing discipleship, and it wasn't really a great thing, but listening to you, but also recognizing later on in my life the importance of what Jesus said and the importance of what discipleship is. And you're right. I remember, if you want to learn anything about God, well, you go to church.
That's right.
And I had godly parents, mom and dad, and they would teach us to pray and all that, but there's also homes where, unfortunately, that doesn't take place. And so the encouragement is people that can get involved with D6 within their home, and then churches and pastors and leaders, it can revolutionize what's happening today in the world of discipleship.
It's really about church and home working together. We want to be very clear with that. And I have a lot of ministry leaders say, but I don't have a lot of parents involved in their kids' life. And that's where I say adopt, reach out, connect with those parents, but be intentional even with the kids who are coming without parents. It can break the cycle.
Ron, thank you so much for sharing with us
Robert.
today. Appreciate it.
It's
And
been
God
great.
bless your ministry